So we can hear some testimonies, people who either worked with Metropolitan Anthony or who helped out or became or were there as children. So we have some of those testimonies today. And so I'm passing the floor to the moderators of this discussion. We have volunteers and friends of the foundation, people who actually work with children. And it's Aleksandra Bazulina and Victoria Bogdanova. Thank you, Natalia, for this introduction. I will be the moderator, and my friend and colleague Victoria will be helping me out. I think I can add that talking about these summer camps in Sourozh Diocese is also part of the heritage of Metropolitan Anthony. It is a unique experience in many ways, and we will hear about it and we will be able to ask questions, or you can probably even argue or discuss things. Orthodox summer camps, similar camps like that, exist today both in Russia and in Britain. And I think we can make perhaps something, you can find something useful. And as a teacher myself, I'm very interested in what we come up with. But before we start this conversation, we can pray, of course. We will ask Fyodor to read the prayer.
Царю небесный, утешителю души истины, и же везде сы и вся исполняя сокровища благих и жизней подателю. Приди и селись вны, и очистенные от всякие скверны, и спаси блаже души наши. Святый Боже, святый крепкий, святый бессмертный,
Holy Mercy.
Святый Боже, святый крепкий, святый бессмертный, помилуй нас. Святый Боже, святый крепкий, святый бессмертный, помилуй нас. Слава Отцу и Сыну и Святому Духу, и ныне и присно, и во веки веков. Аминь. Пресвятая Троица, помилуй нас. Господи, очисти грехи наши. Владыка, прости беззакония наши. Святый, посети, исцели немощи наши, имени Твоего ради. Господи, помилуй, Господи, помилуй, Господи, помилуй. Слава Отцу и Сыну и Святому Духу, и ныне и присно, и во веки веков. Аминь. Отче наш, иже еси на небесех, да светится имя Твое, да придет царствие Твое, да будет воля Твоя, яко на небеси и на земли. Хлеб наш насущный дашь нам днесь, и остави нам долги наши, яко же и мы оставляем должником нашим. И не введи нас в искушение, но избави нас от лукавого. Союзом любви апостолы Твоя связавы, Христе Боже, и нас, Твоих верных рабов, в себе тем крепко связав, творите заповеди Твоя, и друг другу любите, нелицемерно сотвори, молитвами Богородицы, единый человек любче.
Спасибо. И следующее.
Thank you. Now, one more thing before we actually start talking. Let's put the video on about the camps. This is like, this will not be about, I'm sorry, this will not be about the camp. This will be a little, an extract from a bishop with Vladika, with Metropolitan Anthony.
Одно меня тогда поразило, что я понял только много-много лет тому назад. Он нас всех мальчиков любил. Причем он любил нас, каковы бы мы ни были.
He's talking about, you know, the way sometimes people speak in a lame way and yet you understand. And sometimes somebody speaks very well and you don't really understand. And he's giving examples of that. The very first priest he ever met was Father Georgy Shumkin. And this was in a summer camp. At the time, he was just 10 years old. And the priest was maybe about 30, but he seemed like a very old person. And the thing that struck him about this priest is that he loved he says he loved all of us, whatever we were. When we were good, he loved us with this jubilant joy. When we were bad, he changed into pain, and he couldn't understand that. I could understand it with my mom, with my mother, my father, my grandmother, but for a person who doesn't really know me. But then I wanted to say something else. I was maybe 17, and we were in the church before the epitaphius, and I can remember he walked in and kneeled before it, and he stood like this for a while. And the way he stood, the way he was silent, he suddenly became very silent in the church. The church was like the size of this room, and the silence was so full, so deep, that we were plunged into it. And our thoughts, our emotions all went away. We were in this silence. And then he rose and he turns to us, and his face was covered in tears. And he said, Christ died for us on the cross today. Let us weep for ourselves. And he kneeled again. Now, not all of us wept, of course, but our soul was torn into pieces at the time. And the physical tears in this case don't add or distract anything. We suddenly faced this man experiencing the death of Christ, who gave his own son for him, for me, for this other boy that I don't know, that I don't love, and I don't want to know. And yet he is loved by God so much that he sent his son to die for it. And another example of the words that don't work. This is something I've already told you before. You know, I was a young leader at the Russian student Christian movement, and there was a Sunday school. And Professor Aleksandra wanted to make like a model lesson for us. And he invited a famous preacher from Paris, who was really a very good man and a good preacher. And so in our presence, he gave this lesson to the children. The children were sat in the middle of the room. We, the leaders, were standing at the walls, and we were listening, and we were all excited. We really loved what he was saying. But at the end of the lesson, and we started dispersing, Aleksandra caught a little boy of about 7 and said, "How did you like it?" And the boy says, "That was interesting. Pity, though, that the man doesn't believe what he says." Why? Because he was speaking in such a sophisticated way. He was speaking to grown-ups. He's not used to speaking to children. And the children only caught the sophistication, but they did not catch the movement of his soul. If he just cried, they would have understood. And here we need to remember, both ourselves and the children, when we're teaching children the law of God, whether it's our own or somebody else's, you need to share with them the weeping of our heart or the joy of our heart. And it can be clumsy, so long as it is absolutely true, honest, coming from the heart. When you talk to adults, you still need to be sincere and true. And if you can't say something, just admit it. I can't, I don't know how to say it. This is very important. To know where to keep silent.
Добрый вечер, дорогие друзья.
Good evening, dear friends. There's a technical issue. You can write your questions in the chat window, and at the end of the meeting, we can pass them on to all the participants. Now, I want to introduce our first guest. Patsy Fostiropulos. Patsy is an icon painter and one of the founders of the summer camps in England. And this is the person thanks to whom at this time there's a lot of beauty and creativity in the camps. Good evening, Patsy. Could you switch on your mic?
Hello.
Good evening.
Thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this Zoom meeting. I was very touched by what we've just heard from Metropolitan Anthony. I rather wish we'd had that before we started our camps, but I will go on to say more. It's been a wonderful opportunity to look back at the last 50 years. So thank you for inviting me to take part. I'll not be speaking as part of the present leadership, but will be sharing with you a few of my own memories and observations. Before moving on to the memories of camp, I have to say that behind my involvement with camp was a meeting such as Metropolitan Anthony has just described. And the meeting I had was with Metropolitan Anthony. It was in the late 60s that Metropolitan Anthony had been invited to the home of one of my school teachers. Olga had recently rediscovered her Orthodox faith through the books of Metropolitan Anthony. He was invited to speak to a group of her school leavers and young students, and it was to be the first of several such meetings. What struck me first was the way in which he could speak about his faith. He spoke from the heart with warmth and integrity and total conviction. It was through that encounter with him and others in his parish that I was led into the faith of the Orthodox Church that has so enriched and broadened my faith in God. And he visited many groups of young people, I'm sure, in colleges, universities, but one of the first ones that he visited was at a camp by the sea in Wales. Well, that was well before my time, I think in 1958. Sadly, there's nobody here who can speak and tell us about that time, but I gather he had joined in with so much and was, of course, gave many talks and had discussions with the young people there. But it wasn't until 1974 that the diocesan counts as we know them started today. I gather that part of this meeting is to speak about what I remembered about Metropolitan's involvement with camp, but to be honest, he had very little involvement apart from encouraging them to take place and giving them his blessing and putting his trust in the people who were to run them. Father Michael Fortunato was one of these people. He was the choir master and priest at All Saints Ennismore Gardens, and he had always at the heart of his vocation the young and their families. As the number of parishes and Eucharistic communities in the diocese grew, the idea was born to have a camp that could bring the children from these small parishes together, where they could live in the countryside as a community for 2 weeks, play, make friends, and have the opportunity to worship together and learn more about their faith. A place where they could feel they were belonged and share a common life and common faith. You have to remember at that time in England, there were very few Orthodox communities, so children were, maybe just one or two, very few in each community, some of the tiny ones. Their parents may have converted. So it was a real need. Aleksandra Fosteropoulos, now Father Alexander, was one of a number of enthusiastic young men and women who worshipped at the cathedral at that time. He was a student of architecture and was close to Father Michael and they had many talks about their vision of camp. Aleksandra had had a lot of previous experience in youth camps in Greece, and so with Metropolitan's encouragement and blessing, he eagerly stepped up to the challenge of obtaining equipment and organising it. So in 1974, with Father Michael as the spiritual director of the camp, his wife Mariamna as cook, and Aleksandra and myself as leaders, we took the plunge. I remember the first visit that Metropolitan Antony made to camp. I think it was in 1977. He was not a man to stand on ceremony. And if I remember correctly, our church warden, who was the camp cook, Anna Garrett, did have a loaf of bread and salt to welcome him. But after his welcome, he quickly hitched up his cassock and joined in a game of volleyball. I think he quite came towards the end of camp. He certainly gave a talk to a group of teenagers and stayed on for the evening entertainment that the children had prepared and the evening prayer. I think he only visited a couple more camps. In this early camp, we had no chapel tent. 4 trees marked the corner of an area of grass where we met to pray, and a cross was made from 2 branches that served as our focal point. Being England, where there's always rain, we also prayed and celebrated the liturgy in the marquee, where we ate and had our indoor activities. I remember when we went for walks, Father Michael would insist we faced east when we prayed before our picnic. But where was east? Much fun was had with a wonderful group of children at that time. And so the camp grew along with all the marquees and equipment that were needed, moving to 3 further sites, one in southern England and the next 2 in Wales. During the 80s, before moving to Wales, all the equipment was stored in the cathedral. And one year when the tents came back soaking wet, they were hung over the balconies to dry, leaving them under the care of Metropolitan Antony. For many years, Metropolitan would bless the campers and send them on their way from the cathedral to go by coach to the wonderful property high on a rocky hillside in Wales. Wern Watkin was the property of Michael and Sonia Bear. I and my husband, Father Aleksandra, were only there for the first year, and maybe Irina can tell you more about the time of the 90s. The camp became very big, and after the millennium, 2 new sites were found, one in Norfolk, which had buildings, and the other on a new site in Wales, for those who were keen to be solely under canvas. My husband, who was now a priest, and I joined the Scorers and their family there. Despite Metropolitan Antony rarely visiting camps, he was always interested in how they went. And I hope that what we were learning from him, from his books, from his wonderful sermons, from our personal contact with him, was somehow incorporated into the spirit of the camps. One little thing I remember was that in the early camps, the day began with gymnastics, which Metropolitan Antony would have approved of, as I remember him once saying it was good to exercise and wake up the body before morning prayer.
В ранних лагерях я помню...
Get teenagers today to do that. He certainly hoped that the camps would sow the seeds of faith and provide an opportunity for the children to learn more about the gospel and the life of the church. So a time every day was always allowed for this. For the last 20 years, we've had the camp in a beautiful site in Wales, where a shallow river runs along one side, surrounded by hills. Near the entrance at one end of the field is the chapel tent, where the lamps are lit every morning and evening, and it can be seen from everywhere. The prayers that are used morning and night are the same ones that Father Michael chose for the very first camp. Not too long for the campers to be still and concentrate. The children quickly get to know them and join in the singing. A short homily is given during the evening prayer about the gospel for the following morning. The blessing of the camp is the first important event when the whole camp is liberally splashed with holy water. Since 2003, a panachida is always celebrated on the 4th of August to remember Metropolitan Anthony, along with all the departed who've been involved in camp, including, sadly, a few past campers. At the end of camp, the Liturgy of the Transfiguration has always been the feast to look forward to. The children make the prosphora, decorate the chapel, and join in the singing and enjoy the blessed grapes at the end. We always make a visit to our local saint, Isui, who was a hermit who lived in the 6th century, and there's a holy well there, and it's always a very special time. Many traditions developed over the years and were valued and have been incorporated into other camps that have been started by young adults who were children of the first camps. Camping isn't for everyone. There are lots of challenges and new experiences for children. For newcomers, being away from home maybe for the first time and coping with the changing weather, and there's always can be a lot of rain in Wales. Another challenge is getting out of bed in the night when to go to the toilets, which are right at the other end of the field, and this can be daunting. Washing and swimming in freezing water, collecting firewood for some of the cooking, tidying their tents, and getting along with other children in their tents. And in recent years, the new challenge of relinquishing their mobile phones. But there are a lot of wonderful experiences for them, living outdoors in the beauty of the countryside, the games they play, the fun activities, sports, arts and crafts, campfires and singing, and the beauty of the chapel and praying together and the sense of being a community, a family, and making lasting friends. One of the beautiful things about being involved with the camps for so many years is to see many of the children returning year after year, to watch them grow, seeing them grow up, many becoming invaluable young leaders, and then meeting some of them again as parents sending their children to camp. Some of the old campers or parents of campers have given their time to help set up and dismantle the camp, which is a huge task. Some help in the kitchen, and some are now part of the present leadership. There is much to thank God for. Metropolitan, when asked why some come to faith and others do not, said he couldn't say, but he went on to give examples of how people have come to faith. He said, and I quote, "When we speak of faith, we usually speak of a little grain of certainty, which is within us, which is born one way or another. It may be a memory from our childhood." That's it.
Спасибо за внимание.
Пати, спасибо большое за такой искренний рассказ, за историю
Thank you
лагерей.
very much, Patsy, for this sincere description, which really brings us all the way back into the hills and valleys and feeling the cold streams and everything. Thank you so much. We will have the questions for you at the end. And I will now pass the floor to Ksenia Scorer. Patsy mentioned that many people came to the camps as children and then became leaders and or helpers, and Ksenia was just one of these people. Please, Ksenia, could you tell us about your experience there in different roles?
Good evening, добрый вечер всем. I'm going to speak in English. I was quite nervous about being asked to contribute to this seminar, and sort of feel very privileged. I did go to many camps. I first went to the children's camps when I was 8 with my twin, and continued to go as a camper with my younger brother the following year for many years after that. So camp has been a fundamental part of my life. It's an annual event, and not least in that so many of my friends today are those who also went to the camp. And the friendships formed in the camps have been some of the strongest, and not only among the same age groups, but also across generations. I did prepare something which is slightly different, because my understanding was that people wanted to know about impressions of Bishop Anthony from the point of view of a teenager, from when we were young, from when I and other campers were young. So, and I realized that I have very bad memories of his visits, partly because he didn't visit that often. So in fact, what I did was I wrote to a number of friends and asked them to share their experiences and memories of Bishop Anthony in the camps, and not only in the camps. So I will talk about the camps, but in the sort of in how people remember it with meetings with Bishop Anthony, and also how people remember him in other contexts, but from the point of view of, you know, children, as of a child or a teenager. So my main experience of church life was growing up in Devon, not in London. But as my grandparents lived in London, whenever we visited, we'd always go to the liturgy at the cathedral where Bishop Anthony served. So I grew up with an awareness of Bishop Anthony from the earliest age. And he also visited our home on a couple of occasions in Exeter, and celebrated the liturgy a number of times in Devon. So a strong impression when I was little was the way parishioners all moved to the front of the cathedral at the end of the liturgy when Bishop Anthony would preach. But since I had lost all knowledge of Russian by that age, I didn't know what he was preaching about, but clearly realized that it must be good for everyone to gather around him. And my younger brother recalls being struck by the elegance of his movement and poise. And I may have attended some Sunday school sessions at the cathedral, but I have little or no recollection of this, unfortunately. But I feel that there are stories that I've always known about his life, and I seem to have absorbed them either through hearing Bishop Anthony recount them or others who retold them. However, a couple of friends have shared their experiences and memories, and one remembers the following. So one friend remembers Sunday school at the back of Ennismore Gardens and being mesmerized by Bishop Anthony's stories of childhood, a particular story of how little they had and how they shared things. He remembers a story about a cucumber, and about how when Bishop Anthony had his half of it, eating any more of it would have amounted to an act of theft. My friend was very struck by that. Another friend wrote, "We did have talks with him as teenagers round the table in the vestry and heard his wonderful storytelling. I remember a story about a man who asked him to prove that God existed. The bishop asked the man to prove that he loved his wife. The bishop enjoyed telling him that the flowers and jewelry he brought her were just signs of conforming to social pressure, and that maybe he didn't love his wife." So going back to the camps, I don't have any distinct memory of Bishop Anthony coming to camp, which makes me feel as if I have failed yet again in the task of talking today. So I was therefore encouraged to hear from some friends who went to the same camps, write and say, "I can't think of a single thing. Maybe I was too young to kind of register anything." Another wrote, "Yikes, I have no memory of him at camp at all." Thankfully, other friends have more general and detailed memories. One wrote, "I don't have personal memories apart from general awe in his presence and his deep, powerful voice, which was both inspiring and reassuring at the same time. He instilled confidence and respect. I remember him playing volleyball too at camp, not that I ever played." And so another friend writes, "I remember him playing volleyball and having a scary voice." And my younger brother recalled him from the very early camps in the 70s and said he played volleyball with Father Misha, Papa, and some older kids. Volleyball is clearly a strong memory for some. My cousins also visited us from New York in 1979 and therefore also came to camp with us. And one wrote the following: "I do remember him both from camp and from us going to Ennismore Gardens and then visiting him. But from camp, I vividly remember Bishop Anthony coming for Transfiguration. I remember there was excitement that he was coming. I remember being thrilled, this is my cousin again, I remember being thrilled that we could speak in English with him. All the bishops I was used to, and I was used to bishops only spoke Russian with us. My younger cousin, who was 10 at the time, wrote, I do remember Bishop Anthony. I remember him being kind. One of my oldest friends sent me the following message about her memories of camp. I really don't know what to say other than that what we loved about Bishop Anthony was his normalness. He was easy to talk to, had a sense of humor, and was non-judgmental. I have no specific tales to tell other than we all enjoyed listening to him speak, as did everyone, and can still hear his voice now. And he enjoyed being with us as much as we did with him. And she sent me a couple of photographs from the 1970 camp, which show that Bishop Anthony wasn't wearing a cassock, but sensible camping gear, including a warm sweater and Wellington boots. And another very old friend has written, I have a really clear memory of sitting in one of those big round tents in a circle with Bishop Anthony in the middle. I remember feeling really privileged that he was taking our lesson that day and just being a bit overwhelmed by how he seemed to somehow be simultaneously deeply spiritual and otherworldly, yet also very normal. In particular, I remember him telling us a story about his experiences of going to church when he was a boy. What really struck me was that he said things that we all recognized, but which we felt we could never admit. For example, that he always loved communion when he was little because it meant that church had nearly finished. And that he had his own irreverent version of the Lord's Prayer. It was such a relief to hear that these things were normal and that thinking them didn't make us bad people. I do remember being utterly transformed by everything he said and feeling a deep sense of peace and warmth. Sorry, I've lost my place. He spoke with such a gentle voice and managed to say the most profound things in an incredibly simple way. I felt like I wanted all my school friends to hear him speak because I felt like we were missing out on something important. He was such a wonderful man, and I have never been able to articulate quite why. I just instantly knew he was something special, and yet he never behaved as though he was. Such humility and gentleness. Very inspiring and somehow comforting to the young teenage me. There are other memories of Bishop Anthony which people have shared which are not related to camp or the cathedral. My youngest brother reminded me of the episode when we had a picnic with Bishop Anthony in a hotel room in 1978. Our family got stuck in the snow on the way to our patronal feast. Our church was 50 miles from home and Bishop Anthony was due to arrive as well, but was also unable to get through. We were forced to stay in a hotel for 2 nights. Our parents had prepared food for the patronal feast, so we had a picnic with the bishop with the food laid out on a tablecloth on a bed in one of our hotel rooms. However, I think it was one of our first experiences as children staying in a hotel, so it is possible that we were more excited about that fact, especially since there was a swimming pool. My twin cannot recall any specific encounters, but remembers clearly his distinctive voice, as do so many, to the extent that he can do a very good impression. I'll finish now, but one of my friends also wrote, I'm afraid my main recollections are of him as Babushka's friend, the Babushka being the church warden for many years at the cathedral. I would go to their house after school to find Metropolitan Anthony sitting in the kitchen having his hair cut. There was a warmth and informality that shielded me from his importance for many years. My brothers and I grew up knowing Bishop Anthony through my parents and my grandmother. He had been my grandmother's friend for many years. My father had known him all his life. So of course, we probably took him for granted and did not value how truly extraordinary he was. So as children, we felt very comfortable with him and felt that he was very approachable. I don't recall any profound conversations with him, but everything he said that I could understand rang true. And I was impressed that he always remembered us by name and was as warm with us as with our parents and other grown-ups. And he would always greet us with open arms. So I'll finish there. It's slightly different, and it's not just about the camps, but I hope that's all right. Thank you.
Ksenia, спасибо большое.
Thank you, Ksenia, very much indeed for your testimony and the testimonies of your friends. It's a great opportunity to see Bishop Anthony with the eyes of the children of the time. And the image is that of a man that you would want to be friends with. You know, the way you spoke of normalcy, wanting to be with him. This is something that you can relate to. And we now know the importance of volleyball in those camps. And now, because we have some video recordings, we can actually see some of that. We have a little video about the camps. This is a word of thanks to those who gave the video materials to the foundation to make this video possible.
Спасибо за ролик.
And thank you very much for the video. We have received a little message from Elizabeth Theokritov. She's reading the message from chat in Russian.
Родители мальчика слегка были обескуражены, что именно этот мудрый совет мальчик вынес из разговора с епископом.
Да, спасибо, Вера. О, Вика, и я.
Vika, thank you. And I will start, you know, having this new company. I will ask Irina Scorer, one of the founders of the camp movement, and who really made a huge contribution in the camps. The format of the meeting will be a conversation between Vika and myself and Irina. I think you can start it. I wanted to ask, I mean, apart from just having prayer, how did the camps differ from whatever normal scouting camps, for instance? Why would the children be attracted to them? Now, I've never been to a scouting camp, so I don't really know how they pray there, what they do. But just as Patsy was saying, and I know the way they ran their camps in Russian Christian student movement, you know, the day would always begin with matins, with morning prayer, and all the children would gather in the church marquee, and they would have Heavenly King, and one of them prayers from the matins, and the gospel reading, and we would sing just about everything, the Holy God, Holy Mighty, and read and sing the Our Father, and then we would go to have breakfast. But you've been to the camps, you know the way it works. And through all these years, children were brought up from fairly early on. I don't know, back from, I don't know, 1977, 79, there was always a separate marquee, you know, which served as a chapel, not combined with anything else. And all the children knew this was a special place. So if you just had a ball, for instance, go in there during a particularly active game, they walk in with a lot of awe to pick up the ball or something. Everybody knew this was special, and you know, it conveyed that spirit. You know, the whole camp, as a result, I can remember going there. It was like a big village, but a place where everybody believes the same and everybody is friends. And it creates a sort of an even lifestyle that centers around the church and around God and Christ, Savior. And the rest of the time, outside the formal prayer hours, you had normal life. You had games, you had talks, you had some form of classes. But then there was prayer before meals and after the meals, you know, the lunch, the dinner. And there was a rhythm, there was a certain order to things, and everybody knew that without that church in the center, it would all fall apart. It would be a completely different spirit. Obviously, you know, small children or even teenagers don't really understand that. I doubt they reflect on things like that. Yet this was the case, and I think this is the reason for the closeness that now exists between the former you know, children in the camp who then became leaders and who are still friends now, many years later. And in relation to Bishop Anthony, I always think, you know, he did come very rarely. I was part of the camps for almost 40 years, every summer. And even when the children grew up, I would help in the kitchen or just help with finances. And there was a little marquee set up as an office. But over all these, you know, dozens of years, and Peter, that is Father Peter, we always went together. And I think Bishop Anthony only came, I've checked, I have these photo albums where, you know, every year I would make photos and then put them in an album. And I was, you know, just yesterday and today I was looking through those albums, and I saw that he came 4 times, you know, 4 times in 40 years, maybe 5. But I think only 4. And yet there was a lot of enthusiasm when he did come. I can remember once he was coming and everybody lined up, you know, until he formed like an alleyway for him, a human alleyway, so he could drive through the field. And there was a lot of rejoicing at the fact of his coming. And he would always join in whatever was happening, even like laying the tables or talking to one pastor or another. And there was always a point at which, you know, the leaders basically would, I don't know, maybe 10 people or even fewer would come together, and he talked to them. I don't know what he talked to them about. I can remember once I had a diary entry that they got together and they sat around the tent where I was washing the dishes, and so I could hear what they were talking about. So I jotted things down, and I said, he spoke very forcefully, very powerfully. That's all I wrote. But just as Ksenia was remembering here, he was very approachable. He created that spirit, a metropolitan, a priest, a deacon, all the clergy were people you could approach, were people you could talk to. There was no ceremony, there was no special pious bowing or gestures or anything. And yet they were respected. When you know that this is a spiritual person, a clergy, when you can hear them preach or pray or celebrate the liturgy, you do feel a bit of awe, but you don't have to do anything special. You know, there's no bowing, there's no sort of silence. You can talk to them. They're special people, yes, But we are all special, aren't we? I don't know. And I'm rambling, perhaps. Don't know what else I could say, what you would like to hear. You can ask. You know what I wanted to ask? From my experience, seeing the camps, I had this impression that there was a lot of traditions that all the participants really like that and treasure that and keep that. And if I'm right, could you tell me there is one that for you is probably the most important and the most treasured one? Oh yes, I mean from year after year, everybody knew, for instance, that at the end, towards the end, usually we would have the feast of Transfiguration. Somebody would normally come for the feast. A few times Bishop Basil came. So we would have guests on the Sunday, on the given, or whatever feast day. Everybody also knew, because it happened year after year, the same sort of program, apart from the daily routine like prayer and cleaning up the tents and then classes and then games and lunch, and then there's some quiet time, and then there's again games depending on weather. You can go you can go swim in the icy water and so on. And over all these almost 40 years that I took part, there was always, for instance, they all knew there would be the Olympics, there would be, then there was the theme day, this theme day, that is having a special theme. Every year we would come up with a particular topic. There was like a day of Africa, or a day of the book, or we had India, we had Spain. There was either a country or maybe for a theme, and so everybody would make costumes, come up with various things as a program, and everybody knew that this was going to happen. This was generation after generation after generation. This is what's going to happen, and everybody knew this. Obviously, campfires, everybody sitting around the fire and singing songs, all of that. These are simple traditions that sort of small events during the camp, and everybody knew and everybody prepared for those. Was there something that was difficult? Having quite a few children, and then you're organizing, you obviously know the other side when it was difficult. Oh, perhaps, must have been, I don't know. There must have been cases when you had something of a more difficult child, or there would be a quarrel. But this tended to pass very quickly. But it's because of this community, this little village that we formed, and everybody knows everybody, and whose shoulder you can cry into, or who you can complain to, or who is going to give you consolation, or who can give you good advice. Everybody knew each other so well. Even the new people, they came for the first time, they learned very quickly, and they learned the people very quickly, because there were no boundaries, particularly in the last 20 years where Victoria would have come. You know, Victoria, I think you came for 2 years or so. Help me out, I lost my thought. But it's just because the same people came again and again. You know, there'd be Father Aleksandra, Father Peter, while he was still deacon, and then other adults, and the children knew who to go to and who was best. You know, who you go to if it's very serious. So that was really rare. And now, frankly, seriously, nothing particularly bad happened. And the children knew all the grown-ups, and they all knew who to go to and how to resolve. And there was this trust, I think. There was this mutual trust. Thank you. Elizabeth Kritov is writing here that there was a special melody for the Troparion of the Transfiguration written by Father Michael specifically for the camp. Can you remember it? Maybe you could sing it together with Ksenia. Go on. Go on. Together, just the two of us, yeah.
Glory to thy disciples as far as they were able to behold it. Through the prayers of the Mother of God, let thine everlasting light shine also for us sinners, O giver of light, glory to thee. Voilà.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much indeed. And I was thinking, where did this music come from now? I know. This is so unusual. Yeah, well, it's Father Michael. It was based roughly on tone 7, but he kind of made it a bit livelier. Yeah, it sounds indeed joyful. Well, Patsy is saying, when it came, you know, to the camp, and how the whole camp was being blessed, particularly how they would go around the whole territory. Everything would be sprinkled with holy water, everything and everybody, every person separately. And while all of this was happening, everybody would follow Father Michael, Father John Lee, who also, particularly in Wales, for many years was the priest for the camp. And then lately, Father Aleksandra. So there would be this procession, and this is the Troparion we would sing. And I think this is the reason everybody knows it. Well, perhaps I'm done. No? No, thank you, Irina, very much. Thank you indeed. Maybe if there's anything you want to add towards the end, you can do that. And we will pass the floor to Kelsey now. Kelsey Cheshire, who's spiritual daughter of Bishop Anthony and the organizer of the diocesan conferences. Kelsey, good evening.
So I only attended the camps for 3 different times in the mid-1980s. So I didn't ever organize them, but I did a lot of work in them and got to know them, at least in those years, pretty well. And I've been asked to speak about how the church camps could have reflected Metropolitan Anthony's vision, even though he was not often present at them. So these are my thoughts based on the years that I was there. And so it will be just from my point of view and what I understood at the time. Metropolitan Anthony never stopped reminding us that no one can turn towards eternity if he is not seen in the eyes or on the face of at least one person, the shining of eternal life. He himself spent his life wrestling to become transparent to this life, to the divine love. And it was this love shining through him that inspired and changed so many who met or knew him. He had become in his own way like the priest he knew in the French camp of his youth, which we heard about at the beginning of this seminar. This was a man whose heart overflowed with a mysterious love, which everyone could share, and that was never withdrawn, no matter who you were or what you had done. Once one has encountered such a love, even if you can't comprehend it, as Metropolitan Anthony couldn't himself until many years later, it is nonetheless part of you, silently doing its true work. This was the case for the people running the church camps under Metropolitan Anthony. Each of them, in his or her own way, had known something of the love that so often shone through him and had begun to internalize this love. I still remember how this could be felt as an invisible but palpable life and presence in the camp. People had their own personal shining. Some, like Anna Garrett and Deacon Peter, as he was then, had known Metropolitan Anthony for most of their lives, and his way of encountering the world had become part of them. Others had arrived later, but all brought something of his vision into the life of the camp. So life in the camp was a microcosm of the body of Christ. It was a continual encounter with God and with one another, and a continual challenge as well. And Deacon Peter wrote at one point, reflecting on Metropolitan Anthony's vision of that challenge in later years, quote, "We should believe in the human person with the same faith as we believe in God, just as absolutely, resolutely, passionately, and should learn to begin to see clearly in the human person the image of God, a sanctuary which we are called to lead back to life and to glory, just as an icon restorer is called to return a spoiled icon to its former glory." Metropolitan Anthony urged us to do the same in his own words. Quote, "If we only looked at one another, knowing that in this person, the dawn of life, of eternity is at work, that this person is a place where God is alive." But what was essential to this, underpinning everything, was the gift of freedom. Freedom is the only condition which could allow love to be not a mechanical obedience, but what it truly is, a living encounter freely offered and received. This was very, very central to Metropolitan Anthony's vision and to how we should live it and it happened in the camps. And here is a quote from him about this. "God recognizes to man, to whom he has given freedom, the right to use his freedom the way he chooses. And this is where the justice of God is far beyond the justice of the Pharisees and the scribes and the lawyers. This is not to say you are what you are and you can stay as you are, but I recognize you, your validity as you are. God does not love the sinner or the righteous person in view of what he will be when he will be different. He does not love him on condition that he will undertake to change. He simply loves him as he is, not because of what he is, but in spite of what he is. He loves him entirely. And in a second stage, he will call him to change. Well, maybe. He will love him into change, perhaps. He will confront him with the real and perfect man as a challenge to being below the mark. He will call him to become what truly he is." For Bishop Anthony, this freedom was a declaration of trust, as Patsy mentioned in her talk, how much people were trusted to do what they want. He trusted that the image of God in a person was ultimately stronger, deeper than the darkness and frailty that worked against it. He trusted that a person could make decisions that failed, even that were destructive, because even failure was the opportunity for new light to shine on the darkness, unveil it, and show another way forward. In this spirit, I've sensed this very much in the camps. Bishop Anthony left people free to develop life in the camps, guided by what had been planted in their own hearts, by the image of God within them. More often than not, this freedom allowed his vision to unfold creatively, organically, to be more present in his absence than it would have been in his presence. In practice, this freedom and the acceptance without judgment of every person as he or she was something that filled the camp. The whole camp was full of this atmosphere. Along with the challenges of every new day, there was joy and creativity, often harmony. In the kitchen, Anna Garrett reigned as the cook. She had been called Anna of the honest eyes, as she was known in her youth, in whom still waters ran very, very deep and were filled with the wisdom and kindness that she rarely spoke, but which palpably filled the whole of the kitchen tent. In all of the children's activities, people worked together. The schedule was not rigid, but free, in harmony with Bishop Anthony's vision of structures, which should express the relationships of love and freedom in the Holy Trinity, forms which made room for the Holy Spirit to flow freely and to act. There was also much mischief. The two deacons, Alexander, Father Alexander was not Father Alexander at the time, so it was Alexander and Deacon Peter, twirling their censers over their heads in a full circle without spilling the charcoal. It was a sight to be seen. Anya Platt, age 12, trying to scale the kitchen wall to bribe me for special handouts, and the daily ritual of shooing her away. And there was much beauty. Peter and Irina, one late evening, spontaneously singing Russian songs, filled with yearning, with sorrow, with love, with melancholy, with beauty, with tragedy, with wonder, with whatever could be felt in the fire and depths of the heart. And Bishop Anthony did visit one day. He arrived before lunch, joined the children in the tent dining room, and was amongst them as though he was one of them. He liked nothing better than being able to be just an ordinary person. Following lunch, he sat in a circle with the senior camp leaders, and afterwards hiked up his skirts above his knees to play volleyball with the camp leaders or anyone else who would join in. At some point during that day, he told the story of playing a game of cops and robbers with young children, which I think had happened many years before when he was probably still being a doctor in Paris. In the game, whichever child was shot would have to fall down and pretend to be dead. One of the young children was so afraid to die, even though he knew it was only a pretend, that he could not join in the game. Bishop Anthony, or Andre as he probably was then, said to the boy, "I will be by your side. We will play together. And when you are shot, I will fall down and die in your place. So you don't need to. I will die your death." So they did this, and again and again and again, Andre died the child's death and got up again. And finally, the child began to see and feel that he wouldn't die, and he overcame his fear and dared to pretend to fall down dead. I've always loved that story because, in a way, he invisibly and inwardly, this is what the bishop was doing all the time, carrying the burden which another couldn't carry, in solidarity with every person. Vespers finally began at the end of what had been a long and full day. I remember the children were tired. Bishop Anthony certainly was. Inside the tent they gathered for Vespers, there was a sense of warmth and lassitude. The late afternoon light was filtering in through the gaps in the tent. By the end of Vespers, there was an unusual stillness as the children came up to the cross one by one. I remember that Bishop Anthony blessed each child as though he or she at that moment was the only person who existed in the world. With the most extraordinary delicacy, he had for each child a different response. It might be gentleness or immediacy, might be humor, compassion, it might be very intense, it might be a lightness of touch, but his whole being seemed to be nothing but listening, seeing into the heart of each child, seeing into their depth as some perhaps had never before been seen. A sense of great peace filled the tent. It seemed to embody these words of his about the little prince. I quote, "We may see with the eyes of love, with a pure heart that can see God and his image in people, even in those where his image is diminished through layers of appearance and counter evidence, for the true, deep, secret self of man. For it is as the fox tells the little prince, we can truly see only with the eyes of the heart. What is vital is invisible to the eye."
Да, спасибо большое, Келти.
Thank you very much indeed, Kelsey, and for giving this dimension to our conversation. The freedom and the love that you spoke of really penetrate all the memories about the camp and the way it is now. You know, the spirit that you testified to, and something that was really part of Bishop Anthony and is being transferred through those who knew him, and I'm really thankful. Particularly that game where he died for the boy. That's something that is very touching. We have like about 10 minutes left for a general conversation, for a discussion. So if there are any questions, please leave them in the chat window. I have a question for all those who are presented today. Could I ask you what your idea is of the place of the teenager or the children in a parish and how this was reflected in the camps? It's a general question to all, so anyone can speak. Would anyone like to start?
Павловна?
Ina?
В православной церкви.
In the Orthodox Church, you know, when you baptize an infant, and in the first liturgy, the baby or the child takes communion in the same way, equally, just like everybody else, teenagers or old people. It's a person. He may be an infant, but he's a person anyhow. And children and teenagers likewise, they're people, they're persons. And the bishop, he was always the same with everybody. You know, there were people, whether small or big, or young or old. He treated everyone equally, and praise God, in our church, there's no attitude like this. You know, if you are a child, you're not a full member or a full parishioner. in a parish. No. Young or old, everybody's the same. Everybody is equal. Of course, and just like our Savior says in the Gospel, unless you become like one of these children. And I think the beauty and the greatness of the Orthodox faith is that from the tiniest person, everybody is fully a person. And Metropolitan Anthony, he never spoke to a child the same way you speak to an adult. You know, he was not sort of serious or sophisticated, but he was frank and direct in the same way as he was with everybody else. And you know, when we heard that story, when he was dying in a game for the sake of that boy, but in the same way, just like Kelsey said, he would address grown-ups in the same way. He approached every person in the same way, and except he would use a language perhaps that the boy could understand. And Kelsey, Patsy, would you like to add anything? Just switch on your mic if you want to speak, please.
Wait, I have to.
I think there is something about teenagers where they have grown, they've accepted as children many things, almost by osmosis. They have that wonder of life, the wonder of creation. They live very much in the moment. And as they get older, they naturally start to develop more and more their own ideas. They're meeting a lot of other people. They have a lot of other influences around them at school and in society. And I think Metropolitan Anthony certainly, and we all have to try and recognize this stage that they go through of maybe, you know, kicking against what they've known in the past, and wanting to think in a different way. And at camp, certainly they knew that certain things had to be done. And I remember there was one boy who really found going to chapel very difficult and would lie in his tent and say he'd have a headache and make excuses. And eventually I had a long walk and talk with him. And he said, well, yeah, I'm an atheist. He said, why should I have to go to camp? Why should I have to go into the chapel? And in the end, he left early and went home. And some years later, I spoke to him again. And he said, you know, I used to lie in the tent and listen to the singing and think how beautiful it was. But something in me wouldn't let me take part in it at that time. And I think this freedom that the bishop instilled and saw in each person, that nobody can be forced into a faith, or, you know, in the right time, at the right moment, they will have that memory of something maybe in their childhood. I remember what you sent for us all to read about, you know, how to come to faith, and in very many different ways, but one of them was a memory of something in your childhood. And I think this faith that he had in each and every person that is the faith that God has in each and every one of us, has to allow for people to go through different phases in their life and go on caring for them and being there for them. And like the prodigal son, at one point, maybe they open their hearts and turn in a new way.
Thank you, Patsy.
May I want to just say, yes, I think that is so true. And the hardest thing for me in the almost ever in my life, and especially with my daughter, and is to always remember that that image of God, that truth that is in a child, is the one wisdom that will lead them somewhere. And you must trust that far more than anything one can tell them oneself. And really trust that even the most dark things that happen have a purpose and a meaning, and will bring all of us through to the truth, whatever it is meant to be in the end. But it's a very hard thing to trust when things are difficult and people are ill. And but I think it's so essential. And what the bishop did with his little boy is an example of what we need to do all the time with whoever is there, and sometimes with very, very difficult people. He talks about taking, in a very extreme sense of sacrificial love, going down into the pit with a person who is deeply, deeply troubled and whom no one can touch or help. But that at some point, one has to simply be able to go down and do that and stay there with that person. If you can develop enough what's balance in yourself, not to be sucked into something dark, but to be able to know that, also to be deeply in touch with the darkness in yourself, enough that you can really recognize yours in him, whoever it is. So I think that little story is extraordinary of what he did with the child.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much indeed. We're almost at the end of the meeting, but if there's anything you still have to share, this would probably be the right time to do it. But anyhow, many thanks to Kelsey, to Patsy, to Ksenia, for all of your testimonies. And we hope sincerely that we can meet again. Oh, we have a message in the chat. Maybe I will not be able to translate it. Okay, I can translate. Anna is translating the message in the chat. I was a child in the camps and grew up in London, attending any small Dartmouth cathedral. I have helped in many camps since. My children are current campers. At camp, everyone was fully a person, as Irina was saying. In terms of church life, camp was absolutely formative in my spiritual life. The comments of the panelists demonstrate very well the wonderful depth of love, friendship, and the simplicity of worship, which has stayed with me and shaped me throughout my life. Thank you indeed, and I pass the floor to Natalia Likvintseva. This is just to say again, many thanks to all the participants today, to Patsy, to Kelsey, to Irina, to Ksenia. This topic has been sort of gradually being formed through the whole evening today. love and freedom as something that is key, as principles, as it were, in church pedagogics. And Kelsey was very right in showing the way Vladika spoke about it, the way the bishop spoke about it, but we could feel it. We felt it in the atmosphere today, and how the way it was passed on, and the love that you all experienced from the Metropolitan. He indeed had experienced it from people like Father Georgi, and in the camps when he was a part of them as a young person. And these are all sorts of waves of love that bring us back in to the source of this love, to Christ. And so I just wanted to finish today by saying thanks to all of those who prepared the seminar, the interpreters who worked very hard through today, Anna Dick and Natalia Koltsova. And thank you very much to those who provided the video materials about the camp, and Elena Majdanovich, who collected all the earlier pictures of the Metropolitan with his participation in the French camps back in his youth. So many thanks to the great team of volunteers and friends of the foundation who were able to prepare the technical side of the seminar with all the translation back and forth from English into Russian and back, so that we could hear it in both languages at the same time. So many thanks to all of you. And in conclusion, let us see one more video with Bishop Anthony, and really giving us another example of the way he talked to every person, the same way he talks to adults. This is a conversation with children about how you read the gospel. And then we will finish with a prayer. Thank you. Now the video. Well, it's not always a conversation that is as fast as I want it, but it sounds something like, can you read? Yeah. Have you ever read the gospel? Yes. Is this interesting? Is it nice or is it boring? Well, if I'm not made to read pages and pages on end, and if I read just a little bit and then I can imagine what I've been reading, then it's interesting. You know, the same way happens to adults when you read, whether this is the gospel or any other book, and you have to stop at some point because you want to digest a little bit, because you want to sort of take some time to live through what you've just read or heard or experienced. It's not like you're trying to say it all over again in your mind. Rather, you're trying to imagine. This is the way it is, and you want to spend time in this atmosphere. So if you read the gospel, now what do you find there? When your mother or your father reads to you, what do they point out? Well, they point out that Christ sort of speaks against me, like I'm to blame for things. Do you read any other places, any other passages? Well, you do sort of read them. Well, can you do the reverse then? Don't look for convicting passages in the gospel, but rather look for places which touch your soul, which give warmth to your heart. When your imagination starts being lively and happy, and when you want to learn from this or that passage what to do, how to live, how to think, how to act, how to treat other people, and how to relate to the Savior, to Christ. Leave out everything else. If you find one place or several passages like that, where you and Christ already understand each other, when he says something, you can say, yes, this is good, this is beautiful, I agree. Then you know that you and Christ are already alike in some ways. You don't have to imagine God or Christ, that it is enough for you to know that in this he's like me and I am like him. And then remember these passages and try to keep them in you so that they live in you, so that you never forget this passage and that you never act against what you have experienced in this moment. And then you will see that gradually you will begin to know Christ, not the way he's described, not the way somebody else describes, because it is impossible to describe him. Even the gospel doesn't give us a full picture, but it gives you just passages, just bits and pieces, which bring the image of Christ to us ultimately.
Господи, не знаю, чего мне просить у Тебя. Ты один ведаешь, что мне потребно. Ты любишь меня больше, нежели я умею любить себя. Дай мне зреть нужды мои, которые сокрыты от меня. Не дерзаю просить ни креста, ни утешения, только предстаю пред Тобой. Сердце мое Тебе отверсто. Возлагаю всю надежду на Тебя. Ты зри нужды, которых я не знаю. Зри и сотвори со мной по милости Твоей. Сокруши и подыми меня. Порази и исцели меня. Благоговею и безмолвствую перед святою Твоею волею, непостижимыми для меня Твоими судьбами. Приношу себя в жертву Тебе. Нет у меня желания, кроме желания исполнить волю Твою. Научи меня молиться. Сам во мне молись. Аминь.